Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome to Reinventing Parking. There's a parking reform theme that keeps coming up, that before reform, the debate is really heated and fearful. But after the reform, everything tends to go quiet. In one way, that's great, since it means that the feared problems almost never happen. But it's also frustrating for parking reformers because there's often little publicity to inspire other cities unless someone makes a big effort to actually highlight it or investigate it. So I was very happy to read an article recently about an important parking reform in Fayetteville in northwest Arkansas and what happened next. Catie Gould wrote the article, and Quin Thompson was one of her key sources on what happened, how, and why. And both Catie and Quin are joining me for this episode. But before we play the discussion with Catie and Quin, I want to get some quick reaction from Jane Wilberding, who is one of the founding board members of the Parking Reform Network. Regular listeners will remember that Reinventing Parking is now the official podcast of the Reinventing Parking Network, and so we're making this a regular segment in the podcast. Jane Wilberding is a transportation planner and a former guest on the Reinventing Parking podcast. So Jane, you're a consultant. A lot of your work is on parking. What struck you when you listened to this discussion about Fayetteville?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. First of all, thanks for having me. This is great. And I really enjoyed listening to this episode. There was quite a few things that struck me, but obviously the first is just that there are great people like Catie out there who are reporting on things that people don't talk about, which is that parking reforms don't always, result in this incredibly terrible story like so many people think they're going to. As a consultant that, goes and helps cities kind of think through these and even can present to council sometimes, I was also surprised when Quin was saying how easy it was for them to get it passed, because a lot of times what I hear from council members is, oh, where else has this been done? What have the results been? Have you checked up on them since then? And a lot of times, since these things do go well and they just kind of remain quiet, no one really says anything. And so it was really exciting that Catie took the initiative to even write this article. And I really hope that more people do a similar thing.
That was one of the funniest things, actually, wasn't it? That Quin, he was a little bit bemused. Why are you so interested in this little boring reform? How did you find out about us?
And I don't know if you've heard this parking kind of joke that you say in the industry, Paul, but it's something like, the best parking system and the best parking policy is one that no one notices. And the worst one is one that everyone hates, because the best parking experience is when you don't notice it, basically. So it's kind of like that. That's the dream. And so they've really achieved the dream here, and it's, more.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that, but I will be using that from now on. Yes, because it's a running theme, like on-street parking pricing as well. There's such a controversy before it gets going. Once it's going smoothly, there's no more newspaper articles about it, and so it's really hard to find out: is it going well?
Yeah.
Is it going badly?
Exactly.
My assumption now is it's always going well if there's no more news. No news is good news when it comes to parking, as you said.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's really interesting. The Parking Reform Network put together this, parking minimums map. We surveyed, about 250 different cities, zoning codes. And, we looked at a lot of different media articles about, when minimums were eliminated. But I can't think of a single one where minimums were reinstituted. Quite a few cities have eliminated minimums, but very few have, reinitiated them.
I asked Quin that question, and I asked just about every guest who was talking about abolishing minimums the same question, and they always say, no, nobody's talking about that. we have maybe the odd parking problem and we have other ways to solve it. Parking minimums are not on the table at all.
Yeah.
So that's really encouraging. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I dare say we'll have you again. We'll probably alternate between Tony, you, and a few other key people from the Parking Reform Network. And just a reminder to listeners, please do visit the Parking Reform Network website and have a snoop around if you're not already a member. And we're keen on international members. It's primarily a North American thing at the moment, but we have some Australian members. I'm in Singapore, and we would really love more members from all over the world to make this a truly international network. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you.
Talk to you again next time, probably. And now let's get to the discussion with Catie and Quin. I really hope you enjoy it. Catie is in Portland, where she's a researcher with the non-profit think tank, the Sightline Institute. And Quin is in Fayetteville, where he is a city planner. Thanks for being on the show, both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So, Catie, what was that big parking reform that the Fayetteville City Council took in 2015 that you highlighted in your article?
So to summarize quickly, in 2015, all commercial parking minimums were repealed in the city. And this was very interesting to me. There's a lot of towns that are interested in this type of reform, but people think it's something that only big cities can do, where you can get around without a car. Fayetteville is, much smaller than like Portland or Seattle, near where I live. There's like less than 100,000 people, but it's hard to keep up because the city's growing.
Growing really fast, yeah.
Yeah, what's also interesting is that, a lot of cities also have downtown commercial zones that are exempt from parking minimums. But Fayetteville went one step further and just said the whole city, which I thought was very interesting.
Fayetteville is roughly 100,000 people within a metropolitan area of, maybe 500,000, something like that. Is that correct?
That's right. I think our recent census came out at about just over 90,000, 94,000 according to Catie, and I trust her research on that. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we did reach an MSA of 500,000 people, and it is expected to grow, double, in fact, I think by 2035 are the projections.
Okay, but despite that might make people think that there's something like a very urban place at the core of a biggish metropolitan area, but it's not really like that, is it? It's more that there's several towns that have grown, and then there's suburban areas in and around the towns, and it's more or less grown into a blob, but it's not like Fayetteville is the old big downtown of a metro area. It's just one of several downtowns. Is that right?
No, not at all. I think you would call our downtown area maybe 6 or 7 blocks with two significant shopping and entertainment streets. That's it. It's really very small.
So small town America should be able to really relate to Fayetteville in that respect. So as Catie said, so there was one other aspect of this that was mentioned in Catie's article, which was that there were maximums. So my question was, were the maximums after the reform new parking maximums, or were you just kept old parking maximums?
The parking maximums, Paul, those were put into effect before I was on city planning staff, so I'm not exactly sure when those came in. I think that those were an initial stab at parking reform that the city had done maybe 5 to 7 years before, maybe I think in about 2007.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, so they were not part of this reform. They were just left alone for this reform. We'll get back to the genesis of the reform a little later. We'll swing back to that. But for now, let's turn to what happened after the reform. Was there a disaster, or was it utopia? Great things happened? What happened next?
Well, when I first learned about this and wanted to know what happened, the first thing I'll do is try to look up news stories. And of course, there's a whole bunch when this reform passed, right? It was in the news. And then since then, there was nothing, right? So I shot up an email to Quin, and he said, "Oh, I'm happy to talk about it, but don't expect too much. It's not very dramatic," which is the story. This change is very gradual. There's no scathing op-eds about a parking disaster. When this was adopted at City Council at the time, some people were feeling more cautious and nervous, and kind of where it came back to was like, well, why are we defending these ratios? Do we even know where these came from? Are they based on relevant science or studies today? And I think that's really where they lost a lot of the power of these tables that have been in the zoning code for so long. And when I talked to some businesses that are newer businesses that opened in buildings that hadn't been used and they didn't have much parking, it was really curious because I would talk to them and they say, "Oh yeah, we know about this. We're supportive of this reform in general, but I don't think it really applied to us because in their mind, there's no way they would have had to build more parking for this location because it's a historic building or it's downtown. And of course, like many cities, there are ways to get your minimums reduced before this reform, right? You can reduce it if you have bike parking or, you can get waivers and variances. Like there's all this, but the people who remodeled these buildings and opened their business didn't have to worry about any of that anymore. So it's just much simpler.
Quin, to your knowledge, have any of these redevelopments and maybe the occasional new building even, have they caused problems, some of the problems that the naysayers were worried about?
This is where the story gets even more boring, Paul. No, we haven't. We have not had... I think, we've had precisely zero issue with this at all. In fact, it's just been very quiet. And to the extent that I was very surprised to hear from Catie, in fact, I think I'd forgotten about it. We very carefully did it. We did our research, we did it, and then we forgot about it. And it's been a boon to us in a small way, but we haven't seen any negative impact.
Yeah, that's fantastic. The exciting thing about Fayetteville's parking reforms is that they are so boring. Every city in North America could be doing this reform and it would be no drama. No mayor would be turfed out. No councillors will be turfed out of their positions. This is the kind of drama that elected officials like to hear. The lack of drama when they do something good makes people happy, and it's boring. So how can we need to highlight these boring stories more?
Catie, I appreciate your interest. The city of Fayetteville appreciates your interest, but we're curious about how you found us. This has been dormant, as far as I'm aware, since 2015. There was a little bit of Twitter conversation, but it died very, very rapidly, and we've been going about our business here without knowing about it. How did you even find out about us?
Well, I was working on this story about Walmart at the time. Walmart has been reducing their parking ratios in their lots as online shopping has taken off. And we had found a report where someone from Walmart Real Estate had kind of talked about this at length. That was very interesting to me. And sometimes they even ask for variances from cities to build smaller parking lots than what their minimums would allow. And it kind of got me wondering, I wonder what the zoning codes are where Walmart is. They're a very influential business, that they're very civically involved. And that's how I kind of started looking into what was going on in Northwest Arkansas, which is how I found about Fayetteville.
Fantastic. Yesterday when we spoke briefly, you mentioned a tiny element of drama in your metro area is that people from the other counties and other cities around the region resent Fayetteville a little because there actually are parking meters in Fayetteville. Is that right? Could you perhaps paint us a very brief picture about the state of priced parking in Fayetteville?
Of course. I think that discussion came up because we asked, are there any issues surrounding parking? There are always issues surrounding parking in a town, and a small town like ours is no different. We are different from our surrounding communities in that we do charge for parking in our downtown. It is a very, very small amount. It's modest, but people do get parking tickets, and it makes them upset. So all of the parking complaints that we received before this amendment were about lack of parking, or they were about parking meters. Following, it's the same, but these are not parking complaints that are lack of parking about specific businesses. These are lack of easy parking right in front of the place that you want to like to frequent. So we've had no change in terms of citizen input outside of the fact that we do charge for parking, and we will provide you with a parking ticket on your windshield should you fail to pay the meter.
Catie, you mentioned business people who benefited from the reform, and one of the really interesting things about the article was a few specific examples of that, and you spoke to some business people. What did they tell you? And for example, Lewis Chase and his friends opened a restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, part of what draw them to the building is the view, right? And for listeners here, there's an incredible picture that they have of this rooftop bar that is overlooking this historic downtown with mountains in the background, and it looks incredibly charming. Um, and parking wasn't really at the top of their list of their concerns. Sometimes a customer might complain that they had a hard time to park because they are downtown, but being downtown was very important to them. There's other parking lots that are nearby. People can kind of figure it out.
Yeah, so it's a park once and walk area. It doesn't need parking on every site, every building.
Yeah, so they have a couple of parking spots in the back of their lot that they mostly use for employees. And I think the other restaurant was the same, where they have a handful of spots, but it's a very, very small lot and it's not really for customers.
And was that a very similar story for Atlas, the restaurant?
Yes, it was.
That was a newly renovated building. That renovation presumably wouldn't have been possible if not for these reforms.
Well, certainly more complicated.
Do you wanted to jump in, Quin?
Well, I did. I just wanted to say that, I think that really is an important factor because one thing that I've learned through the years that developers like the least is uncertainty. They like to eliminate as much uncertainty as possible when they're evaluating a site. And that's really where the genesis of this reform was, or this amendment came out of conversations with people repeatedly on certain specific building lots.
Yes, uncertainty. Catie mentioned variances and waivers, but that's just not good enough, really.
Well, in addition to variances, there were also fees in our downtown area associated with that. I think we charged approximately $1,200 for the removal of a single parking place, and so that can be a cost.
Many downtowns have parking minimums, but specific developments are allowed to provide less parking or zero parking so long as they pay a fee in lieu, and that's a nice source of revenue. But again, it's a barrier to redeveloping old buildings or redeveloping vacant sites in difficult to develop areas. So was that part of the conversation, that this problem that you would now no longer get that revenue stream?
Not at all. It was insignificant. Mostly people did not opt to do that. The conversation was really around our city council, our planning commission and city council conversations were around, first of all, talking about the history and the source of the parking minimums. I think Catie touched on that earlier. Where do we get this information, and why are these standards? So once we went, at first in depth about where those came from and what they were, and I think our council was really shocked to find that there is not a great deal of research or even basis for those parking minimums. That was kind of step one. And then step two was to talk about specific lots and sites that could benefit downtown. But really, that was kind of a knockout punch to begin with. And I honestly haven't read my staff report to our commission in many years, but I think that was a really significant part.
Catie has helpfully looked up those old minimums for us. Were they unusual in the context of North America, or were they fairly standard minimums, parking minimums for restaurants, bars, retail?
I've read through a lot of parking minimum documents for different cities, and they're all very, very similar. Like, I'll give you some specific examples. So for a restaurant, requires one parking space per 100 square feet of gross floor area. That's incredibly common, that ratio. Retail is 1 per 250 square feet, right? These are standard ratios that almost any city's zoning codes have.
Fayetteville was not unusual in its situation relative to hundreds of similar cities in the before situation, but the unusual thing is you took this step, and we've already started talking about the before situation, and you said that just highlighting the lack of science behind these minimums. But what triggered you to be interested in the parking minimums at all, Quin?
I think we had a culture in our planning office of a very much an open door in which anyone could really come in and speak to a city planner about a specific property, and it occurred many times a day, and depending on who walked into my office door, I would talk about the specific property on our main highway or something downtown, and we would sometimes over a period of 2 or 3 years, I recognized that there were certain properties that were attractive to people that had been vacant for quite a long time, and they had developers interested in them, business owners and operators were interested in these sites, but we weren't able to get past some part of some conversation there was ending their interest. And, I can't be sure what all the details were. There are many, myriad issues that come up in development or in the hopes that someone may have for a business. But this was one that bothered me, and it lodged in my brain just a little bit over time. And I think one day I just thought, this is something we can control. We can't control financing. We can't control someone's business plan or their own personal energy. There are millions of things, but this is something we can do. And so naively, I perhaps when I look back on it, I thought we could change it. And then we began.
Very often when I ask people that, they mention they read something by someone like, say, Donald Shoup or someone like Catie in some forum, or maybe they observed some other city somewhere. They read about some other city. Like, for example, I think in the timeline you were talking about, Buffalo had very recently done something similar. Do you recall hearing this as something that was in the air?
I think, I did this in concert with my at the time planning director, Andrew Garner. And he had been to a conference, I believe, and had heard a talk about Shoup. But, none of us in our planning division actually had proper city planning backgrounds. We were not planners. I had an architecture background. We had one food scientist who worked up through our division, and Andrew had an environmental science degree. And so we're not really policy planning wonks in that way. This was really about a very specific issue, and then once, of course, we began having the conversation, we did our research and we began reading. And I'm familiar with Shoup, the godfather of parking reform, isn't he called? And certainly read some of his articles. I referenced him in our staff report and quoted him just a little bit for some support, because we were looking for expert support outside of the city.
Okay, yeah,
sure.
And it's very clearly the motivation was this was an obstacle to redeveloping sites that were languishing. It wasn't about any kind of like public transport driven agenda or bicycles or pedestrian advocacy. There were not advocacy groups pushing you to do something like this.
No, not at all. That's right. This was very much just a staff-led idea.
Okay, interesting. One of the things that's really striking from Catie's article, and she's already mentioned this, was that one of her motivations was she noticed that this was a citywide reform, and rather than just the downtown. And as you say, the downtown is pretty tiny. Were most of those problem sites that you'd been hearing about and which were prompting you to think about the parking minimums, were they in the downtown, or were they a little more scattered than that?
They were scattered out just a little bit. And so, like a lot of towns in Arkansas, and I think small towns in the United States, at a certain point, a main city street becomes a state highway. That highway grows over time until you have a 5-lane thing with 90 feet of right-of-way. And what that does over time is take, and what I noticed it doing, is it's taking small business lots and removing parking area from those. And so I kept seeing 2 or 3 that had issues where we had actually removed land and widened roads to the extent that those properties were no longer viable. That was really the kernel that really gave us the idea.
And another striking thing, I guess, in this reform is that it's all about the commercial land use, the commercial parking mandates. There's no mention of residential parking reform, and that's clear from what you said about where this was coming from. No one was talking really about residential affordability or anything like that, and the parking reform around that. Did anyone, as the process went forward, did anyone pipe up and say, oh, why don't we just abolish all of them, including residential?
Yes, actually, that was some commentary that we received about it, that this wasn't radical enough, actually, and so we looked at it and we thought, well, let's just try this for now. Part of there are different reasons for that. Many of the complaints that we would get about parking, and you have to understand that we're a university town, and our university has quite a large percentage of our population. It may be 30% of our population, something like that. So there's a lot of pressure from students. Students have cars. Students park. They live in dorms. They try to get all to one area and park. So we didn't think that was appropriate. We know that people would enjoy that and take advantage of it. We've been building thousands of apartment units a year for a decade. It seems like, and so parking area is a problem for residential apartment complexes as well as for commercial buildings.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's an interesting theme, and it's an interesting dilemma for other cities considering parking reforms. Should they do some modest, small reforms and demonstrate that the sky didn't fall down, and then extend them, such as just abolishing in the downtowns. You went a step further than that and abolished commercial all over the city. But some cities that are now seen as bold reformers, actually they had some previous iterations of reform in the past. So it's not unusual to be a little cautious at the beginning. But you were actually very bold with that first step. So that's why we're talking. We
were, but we didn't start there. We did start with a more conservative idea, and we we understood that other cities were doing downtown areas or entertainment districts or something like that and removing parking. And so we looked at that initially. But then, as we talked about earlier, a number of these properties that I had looked at were not within that area and would never be within that kind of area. These were very much suburban strip type properties. And we could not figure out how to draw a boundary that made any sense to encapsulate our downtown with this, and then also to grab these other areas. It just started to look really silly. And we did draw it, and we tried. And so it was actually Andrew Garner, the director, who said, let's just do it all. Let's just do it. And I think I looked at him and thought, my goodness, well, okay, why not? Let's do it. Let's try it.
That's a great story, actually. That really captures it, and I think a lot of city planners around the world will be able to relate to that. And let's hope they jump in the same direction as you. So we've established that, like the various questions people might have, they might have initially been thinking, well, Fayetteville could do this because it has excellent public transportation, or growth was very slow, or some other reason why it's unusual that, maybe it's a university town, but it seems none of those reasons are the reason you could do this and others can't, which suggests maybe others can do this.
Oh, I would think so, absolutely. We do not have excellent public transit. With all respect to the folks that are working in that space, I think they would agree that we don't have good coverage, and we don't have regular buses, and we're not an especially walkable town. There are certain parts of town that are better in that respect, but we're very much a suburban town that's grown. Our growth spurt was not at the right time for urban planning, in a sense. It was all during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which was about sprawling developments. And so, we don't have any really different or special characteristics from many towns in Arkansas or the Midwest or South or anything, as far as I'm aware. We're very normal.
One more question for Catie. We've talked a lot about restaurants and bars as examples of the kinds of businesses. Were there any cases of retail in the examples that prompted the reform, and also since the reform have retail or some other mixed-use kind of buildings taken advantage of the parking minimums abolition?
Oh, sure. There is a couple. Not everyone made the article, but we're talking about suburban development right now. There was one example of like an abandoned gas station that had been closed for a long time that turned into a little retail store. And that didn't make it into the article. They still have a parking lot, a sizable one, but they had, like 12 spaces instead of 16, right? So that's like a really subtle change. People often jump to thinking that once you take away these minimums, nobody's going to build any more parking at all. And that's really not true. It just gives people the flexibility to build however much they want.
I would really like to add to that, Paul. I think that's a really important point. That may be one of the most important points of this to me. That was our goal, but it also really reflects what we've seen. Our economy and our development economy in Fayetteville is very robust. We've been growing very quickly for 15 years, 20 years, especially in the last 10. And we see still mostly new properties on new lots. And those folks are not choosing to not build parking. In fact, they're typically, though they're not required to, they typically like to meet the pre-existing parking lot minimum standards. Those are still very much accepted by civil engineers that may be working with a developer, by financiers who are actually holding the note on these projects. And so part of our conversation was that we thought there were further backstops behind this idea, and that the city perhaps was not the best one, that there would be both other ways that this would be managed outside of us.
Right, yes. There's this misunderstanding, isn't there, that when something like this is proposed, people conflate the idea of abolishing parking minimums, and they somehow in their heads drop the word minimums or mandates and think it's about abolishing parking, which as Catie mentioned, and as you just mentioned as well, it's not about abolishing parking, it's about giving some choice. And so for the majority of the kind of sites in the suburban areas or whatever, most developments, when they are doing their due diligence, they work out, well, we probably need quite a bit of parking, roughly similar to what was before, maybe just a little less, but it's an easier process because the decision is theirs. They can do that. And on difficult sites or on places that are in park once and walk areas, because of the legacy of past parking mandates and the legacy of past development patterns, there's often a glut of vacant lots and parking in the area. So the idea that you need parking on site for all of those places, now they have a choice to either have just a little bit or none, and they can now develop where they couldn't previously develop. But there's still, in a place like Fayetteville, there's still a lot of parking in every neighborhood. It's not like we're squeezing the parking.
That's right. It really is beneficial, as you've said, to infill development and to those older sites, older historic sites. I'm sure that Catie sees this in Portland as well, and I know she does. It's something that every city deals with, especially when we're dealing with infill.
One question about the politics of this, going back to the before situation. If I'm not mistaken, this parking reform was taking place in a period where there were quite a lot of planning changes happening in Fayetteville. This was just one of quite a few. Which of those changes were controversial, and was parking particularly controversial in the context of these various other changes that were happening?
No, not particularly. I think just prior to my joining the staff a few years prior, the more complicated and more difficult sorts of amendments had to do around zoning, form-based zones, and new kinds of approaches to placement of buildings within sites. I think that was a much greater project than what we did. Ours was surprisingly small, and I think we were surprised at how easily it went through our city council. We were pretty strategic about when we did this and how, and the certain personalities that we knew we would be working with. We tried to make sure that each one of their arguments would be addressed before they asked. And so, well, now I'm getting into kind of the way we approached this, but this was not a particularly challenging amendment to happen. We sort of were very surprised at how easy it was.
And again, that circles us back to this idea that this reform was so boring, there's no reason why you should be afraid of it. Cities all over the world, just do it. It's not so scary. Would I be correct to say that nobody is clamoring to have the parking mandates back?
Oh, not that I'm aware of. I don't think there's any interest in that at this point. It's been a success in Fayetteville. I think it's been very clearly can be proven to be so. So,
Catie, do you have any final comments or words of advice for other cities considering this reform in light of the experience of Fayetteville as you've found it?
You know, I watched the city council hearing where this was adopted, and this one person's testimony has really stuck with me about how in Fayetteville, in the building code, there's no requirement for closets. Yet all houses have closets, right? But they have different size closets in different rooms, and people can pick what works for them, and they have a lot of flexibility, and it's not really the city's job to mark off if you have enough closets or appropriately sized closets, that if there's a market demand, it will happen. I think it's like a great way to talk about it, right? That we're not trying to get rid of parking. We're not trying to get everyone out of their cars overnight. We're just trying to give people some more choice and flexibility for a city to kind of grow naturally like they used to before we put all this zoning and codes in place.
Well, thank you very much, Catie. We just have lost Quin right at the end here. If we get him back, we'll say goodbye to him properly. But for now, thanks very much for being on Reinventing Parking.
You're welcome. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.